is back into it in Chester. Here's El Senior. Yes! Yes!
The center back, Jacob Glesnes, is going for it.
Oh my God! What a goal! And that will do it! One of the best comebacks in recent years. 3 unanswered by the Union. And they go into the Gold Cup break, winning it 3-2.
Hello and welcome to the Free Kick Podcast. My name is Todd. Well, this Sunday marks the start of back-to-back home games for the Philadelphia Union after it seems like a long road trip down in Florida, with Union only getting 1 point out of the Orlando and Inter Miami game. Not that I have to remind you guys of that, because you guys are already complaining about that enough on social media. But this Sunday, the Philadelphia Union, they take on the Chicago Fire at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember, guys, 4 out of 5 games coming up for the Union are at home. So I've been saying it. It means a minimum of 11 out of 15 points. And it all starts this Sunday with Chicago. But returning to the podcast is the voice of the Chicago Fire and one of the co-hosts of the brand new podcast called the Intercontinental Football Show. He is Mr. Tyler Terens. Tyler, how are you doing?
I am well, Todd. Thank you very much, both for the invite back onto the pod and, of course, the plug for the for our own podcast as well. I guess that makes us rivals now, if we weren't even more so heading into this. But it's good to be in the podcast space and doing it with Arlo, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I've been wanting that guy to get into the podcast scene for the longest time, and then when I saw you guys advertise the podcast on the feed this week against Toronto, I was like, no way. Like, this is like the coolest thing ever. And so I checked out your first 2 episodes, and I think it said every Thursday you guys are releasing episodes. And I'm not sure why more MLS teams in the league just aren't starting podcasts. It just makes sense. It's major props to you guys for starting this, because it's a great way for fans to feel connected to the club. Fans can get involved by sending in questions, I believe, at ifs@chicagofirefc.com. And it's just a way for fans to keep up with all things soccer and MLS. Obviously, it's started by Chicago Fire people, the Premier League, and just football globally. So, like I said, just major props to you guys for starting this podcast.
Yeah, man, it's a lot of fun. And it's early days, but we're hoping that we can hopefully, keep it going as long as we can and get as many listeners as possible. But it's definitely exciting.
What gave you guys the motivation to start a podcast?
We've been wanting to do a podcast at the Fire for a while, and we actually were thinking about doing it. It was in early stages last year, and it was just going to be more sort of like evergreen storytelling and the history of the club, and like getting some interviews and stuff like that. And it was just going to be me, and then having any sort of topic or story to tell. And then, we kind of put it on hold. It wasn't the right time to do it, whatever the case may be. And then this year, once Arlo was in town, our senior vice president of communications, Sean Dennison, was sort of like, let's restart the podcast idea. And that was a couple of weeks before Arlo had gotten there. And he sort of had this crazy idea of like, what if we can get Arlo to be your co-host? And I said, well, that would be pretty cool, because if he told me 5 years ago that I'd be hosting a podcast with Arlo White, I probably would have called you crazy.
Yeah.
And Arlo, has always wanted to get into the podcast space. He, doesn't do one with NBC. The Robbies, the 2 Robbies have their show, and Arlo, got his start in radio, and he really enjoys that space. And, he was more than excited to do it. He just needed to get the sign off from NBC, and he did. And now here we are with the podcast, and it's going well so far. Yeah, we're recording the 3rd episode tomorrow night. The time differences are tricky to begin with when he's going to be back in England, but when he's in Tokyo right now calling the women's national team on NBC, it becomes even more tricky. So we actually recorded episode number 2 immediately following the Fire's draw against DC last week. So I had just finished up calling a game, and I immediately went home, got changed out of my suit. I was actually feeling incredibly under the weather as well. And then we ended up, recording the podcast. And as soon as the podcast was done, I took my shirt off, went right into bed, and curled up into a ball for like 15 hours. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but it's been great so far. And Arlo's obviously world class. So, and we have some good banter as well. So it just makes it very, very easy and very fun.
Is it way too early to call you the American Arlo White, Tyler?
It might be a little early for that, and I don't know how Arlo would feel about that either. So let's hold off on that for now. I'm just the Liverpool loving Tyler. That's what we can call me right now.
There we go. We'll stick with that for now. But before we talk about the Chicago Fire game and Toronto FC game, and you're probably like, man, I don't need any more people boosting my ego. But the last time I listened to you call the Fire game was against the Philadelphia Union, and I was like, you know what? Let me go ahead and watch the Chicago Fire game. And I've got to say, from when the Union last played the Fire to listening to you call the game with Tony against Toronto, You're sounding super confident calling the game. This is your second year, I believe, with the Chicago Fire. The chemistry just between you and Tony, it's great. And the one thing I got to give you guys props for is you give credit to the other team's players, which, look, you guys work for Chicago Fire. You guys don't have to do that. You guys are calling the game for the Fire, but you guys will go out of your way and say, yeah, this player for this team made a good player. This player did that. I really like that. And I really liked how you both brought up Michael Bradley playing his youth soccer in Chicago when his dad was the coach of the Fire. And you guys were talking about Michael Bradley facing off against Brad Guzan in the youth. And that totally slipped my mind that Brad Guzan was born and raised in Illinois. And I didn't even think about that until you guys mentioned that. So just want to give you both the props for a great game you guys called against Toronto.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate that. And listen, that's our, that's what we were brought in to do. And, Tony and I don't really like the, the homer aspect of calling a game and, only being shaded towards one side. Tony, obviously has called World Cups and, he was a national broadcaster for a long time. And when we both got the job, we said, listen, we don't want to do anything other than call the game nationally. Obviously, the Fire sign our paychecks and we need to be, a little bit careful about what we say as far as they're concerned. But, giving credit to the other team and there's another team playing out there and you have to sort of call the game that way. Right. So, as painful as it can be sometimes, especially given the Fire's run of form as of late, it's still, I love this game and I love this league. And, being able to pump up and big up players and teams from around the league is only going to benefit everybody in the long run. And it makes our broadcast look like a national broadcast, which is what we wanted to do in general. So I appreciate that compliment, Todd. And I'm sure I'll pass that along to Tony as well. I'm sure he'll appreciate it too.
Yeah, no problem. But speaking of that Toronto FC game, unfortunately, the Fire lost that game 1-2. And I'm sure you're like me, Tyler. I still cannot wrap my head around how Chicago only scored 1 goal against Toronto. I believe you guys had 32 shots that game. Alex Bono was just excellent with 13 saves. Crazy to see that many saves. And it's not like they were easy saves either. You guys had an expected goal of 3.5 and he just made world-class saves, in my opinion. And it's just watching that game, I couldn't believe that only 1 goal. You guys look so good on the night. Frankowski, Alcedo, Madron, Sekulic, all excellent on the night for the Fire. You guys moved the ball really well, I thought. You guys, for the most part, shut out Jefferson Salteldo, in my opinion. And yeah, he scored that early goal and everything. You guys had the mishap clearing the ball in the back, but to not at least get a point out of this, I kind of feel bad for the Fire.
Yeah, it was definitely a difficult one to swallow. And for all the reasons that you just said, I mean, an XG of 3.5 is it's pretty obscene. And there was a statistic that came out after the game as well, sort of in a post-match report that said, given the statistics and given the way that the game unfolded, this company that generates these stats basically said, if you were to run out this game, given the stats over 100 times, I think the Fire had a 98% chance of winning and Toronto had a 1% chance of winning. And then obviously the other 1% is a draw. So, when you hear stats like that, it blows your mind even further. I mean, the Fire had an XG of 3.5. Alcedo alone had an XG of more than 1. That means Alcedo himself put himself in enough opportunities to at least be worth a goal. So, it was really, really difficult, not only to see it unfold, but to try to call it as well, because, I don't know if you heard, but, Tony and I were just sort of he was saying, we just got to put this on a loop. The Fire with a great chance and they have an open look and, it's straight at Alex Bono or Bono makes a good save. And to be fair, Alex Bono did play very well and he put himself in good positions. The save on Alcedo right after the opening goal from Soteldo, he guessed because he didn't have any other choice. It was a giveaway from Toronto. Alcedo takes a big touch into space and he's basically 12 yards away from goal with nobody near him. And he takes a shot and Bono just guessed. I mean, that's all it was. And he made a couple of really, really good saves. I think the one on Frankowski when he went for the curler was a very good save. And then he made a kick save on Beric in the first half as well. So credit to Bono, he played well, but a lot of those shots are right at him as well. So it's not like he stood on his head, Tim Howard against Belgium, a la, World Cup 2014. It was nothing of the sort. But Bono still had a lot of work to do. And credit to Toronto because, they're in the midst of a big overhaul. And it's not just because they got rid of Chris Armas, but clearly that system and that Red Bull's, high pressing style that he brought over there wasn't working. So now they sort of have to forget what they learned. And Javi Perez, his background, he's a Real Madrid youth coach. He's a U18, U20, US youth national coach. he's been around the block a little bit, obviously not at the senior level, but, and he's got them playing some good football right now. He made all the right decisions. He brought in Nick DeLeon and put him at right back, which is not his typical position. He likes to play in the middle of the field. So, credit to Toronto and credit to DC United in that midweek draw as well, because, they didn't give up, and Kevin Paredes is a stud and came off the bench and gave them a spark. And, the Fire have run into some interesting propositions as of late. Obviously, it wouldn't look that way from the standings between Toronto and DC, but DC's crept up to about 10th place right now. And, it's one of those ones where the Fire clearly didn't have their finishing boots against Toronto. We're not able to see the game out against DC. It was a 2-game homestand in which they desperately needed, probably at least, 4 points, if not all 6. And now you're sitting here and you're in second to last place in the Eastern Conference, still just 10 points out of a playoff position. And I believe it's still NYCFC who still occupy that. But, it's getting late in the schedule, not late in the season. And when I say that, I mean that the Fire have their last 11 of 15 on the road, because obviously the Bears start to play at Soldier Field. So these home games that you have right now are just so crucial. And they have a little homestand coming up after the Philadelphia game, and then a little road swing to Florida, the same one that you guys just did with Orlando and Miami. So those are going to be games where you almost need to get 3 points in every single one at this point in the season. But yeah, the Toronto game was, I mean, what are you supposed to say about that? They tie club record for shots. They only have 1 goal to show for it. It's brutal. There's no other way to put it. It's absolutely brutal, and it showed sort of the ugliness of the beautiful game in terms of and what makes it so great is that you can dominate the game like that. It's one of the few sports in the world where you can do that and then still end up on the wrong side of the scoreline.
Look, something you said a few months ago on the podcast when we were first previewing the first Union versus Chicago game is that the Chicago fans, they need to be patient, wait for this team to get healthy. And I think the last 6 games for the Fire, 2 wins, 2 draws, and 2 losses. It's not great, but I think we are starting to see the team get fully fit to where they want to be. We're starting to see them play the attacking kind of football that Raphael Wicki wants to play. And like you said, it's getting late, especially that's crucial. I didn't realize you guys had 11 out of 15 games on the road. And us Union fans talk about it all the time. To only have 2 road losses so far this season on the road, we're kind of surprised. I mean, we tied against Atlanta. We tied against Chicago. We tied against New York Red Bulls late in the game, where those easily could have been losses on the road, but somehow, some way, the Union found a way to come back and get a point where, some Union fans are like, oh, we should never lose the lead against Chicago when we were up 2-1 going into halftime. But Chicago, and we'll talk about that game right here in a second, to their credit, they came out running, and I guess might as well just go straight into that game. And we all remember that game ended 3-3. It was a pretty chaotic day before the game even started, because I believe Union fans said that tornado sirens were going off in the city before then. You guys were under a tornado warning, and then the game starts and it is absolutely pouring outside from the looks of it on TV. And like I said, you and Arlo White are doing a podcast now, so to hear Arlo White call a Chicago Fire game, so used to hearing him just call Premier League games, and to hear him calling a game in MLS, I was like, this is awesome. I don't care if you're a Chicago fan. I don't care if you're a Union fan. It doesn't get better than that, than to hear Arlo White calling an MLS game. And I believe he called a couple more after that game as well. And I did feel bad for you a little bit on the touchline. Arlo took your spot, so you're down there getting absolutely soaked. But at the same time, too, you guys scored an own goal that the Union scored. And so that had to feel pretty good. And then moments later, the Union scored a bicycle kick with Quinn Sullivan, who makes his first start for the Philadelphia Union. And yeah, what a way to introduce yourself, scoring a overhead kick, bicycle kick, whatever you want to call it. But both teams, in my opinion, probably felt like they could have won that game. But at the end of the day, a point was probably deserving for both of them.
Yeah, and the good part about that game, Todd, was that actually the rain stopped almost like as we were about to kick off. It was still incredibly wet on the field, and I'm sure you could see the excess of water that Soldier Field typically is very good at draining, but when you have that much water throughout the entire course of the day, it was just impossible, kicking up all over the field. So that's that as far as the weather's concerned. But yeah, I mean, it was. I think that you can make the argument that a 3-3 draw was probably the right result, the right amount of goals, and the whole thing. I mean, you think about Navarro's, the own goal, and I believe it was Glesnes who had the own goal at the beginning of the game, and then the own goal at the end of the game. I mean, those two are crazy deflections. Bobby Shuttleworth makes a save, he punches it off of Sekulic, and it goes in. I mean, Navarro sent that ball, 5 yards outside of the penalty area, comes off Glesnes, and then it's a perfect looping ball over Andre Blake, and it goes in. So, those two kind of cancel each other out. And then, the set pieces, both the Fire and the Union, I think, had great opportunities that they missed. And then they end up getting, some goals that were really well worked in the end. I mean, the Quinn Sullivan one was a fantastic finish and coming off of a set piece. And then, Madron and Sekulic linked up for a really good set piece goal as well. So it really was balanced all over the field. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the Fire actually reintroduced their 3-back system in that first game against in that game against Philadelphia as well. So that was the first time that we had seen that since MLS is back last year. Since that Philadelphia game, like you said, it's been 2 wins, 2 draws, and 2 losses. And you could even make the argument that, the Fire experienced their first real loss in the 3-back system against Toronto on Saturday. You could say the Nashville game, but they were down to 10 men, after 16 minutes. And it was just one of those games where you're just like, what on earth is going on? Let's toss the tape out. Let's never listen or let's never watch this again. There's nothing to pull from this game. You know what you did wrong. Let's move on. So in my head, that was sort of the first real loss that the Fire experienced. And it was a loss in which they set a club record for shots and, they just couldn't put the ball in the back of the net. And yeah, listen, that's going to happen sometimes. It happens to the best teams in the world. It happens to Barcelona. Now, granted, it's a totally different proposition, but it happens. But yeah, I think that game in particular was a good indication of sort of what the Fire can bring to the table when they are set up in that 3-back system. And, you guys utilize your width really well with your fullbacks. And, I not off the top of my head, I don't believe that you guys had your full complement of starters out there. I know Quinn Sullivan got the start and everything of the sort. So, that goes down. And then between the starting positions of Boris Sekulic and Miguel Navarro, when you're playing in that 3-back system, and especially Boris Sekulic, who loves to get forward, they really pin back, Kai Wagner and Olivier Mbaizo. And a lot of what you guys created actually didn't even really come from them, which is unlike you guys. And it's a credit to what the Fire did, but it's also a credit to you guys for being able to figure it out on the fly. And that's why you guys are defending Supporter Shield champions. So, this is the third time these teams are meeting. Before I came on with you, I was in the middle of writing the scouting report. And at the end of the day, this is very much going to be a game in which these two teams know more than enough about each other to be able to, there's no scouting report needed, right? We know exactly what you guys are going to do. 4-4-2 diamond. You're going to try to suck everybody in, play Mbaizo and play Wagner out wide, and then you're going to try to provide service to whoever's playing up top. And I actually thought that the Daniel Gazdag, look up top against Miami was interesting. I'm not sure if that's a long-term, spot for him, but it certainly was an interesting look. And I really like Gazdag, and I think that he either made his debut or it was his second game against the Fire. But he looked really sharp when he came on against the Fire, and he provided some interesting things. So again, I think that this is going to be a war. You got to win your individual 1v1 battles and just sort of, that each team knows each other at this point. It's the third time you're playing and know what the other team's about at this point. You haven't been paying attention or you just don't care. So, I think it's going to be just going to be a war and a battle and see, you know what I can do and I know what you can do. Let's see who can do it better.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up good points. I think this is going to be a very, very tough game because, look, the last 5 games between these two clubs, there's been 2+ goals scored in each of those games. Now, granted, the Union are 3 wins, 1 loss, 1 draw in those games. And the last time these two teams played last season in Subaru Park, Andre Blake got hurt. Joe Bendick had to come in to finish out the rest of the game. You guys had a chance to tie the game up late on in the game if it wasn't for Andrew Wooten, the striker, saving a goal line chance for Chicago. And yeah, that could have been a major blow for the Union to lift the supporter shield if we would have dropped all 3 points against you guys and only picked up a point. So these guys always play very, very tough. And the one thing you're always going to get for any neutrals out there that aren't the biggest soccer fans, you're always going to get goals. Like I said, 2+ goals in the last 5 games between these guys. So if you're just turning into soccer, why not watch this game? Because you're guaranteed to get a goal. Now, watch me say that, and this ends up being 0-0. Hopefully that's not the case. But in my opinion, for the 3 keys to the game for the Union, number 1, you were talking about this earlier. The Union, they have to defend set pieces. Like you said, Madron played 2 beautiful balls into the penalty box. One of them from a free kick, one of them, I believe, from a corner kick. The Union, they didn't mark Sekulic at all. Pineda was free somehow, just terrible man marking from the Union, and they scored 2 really good goals. And like I said earlier, just Madron, a handful for Toronto, who played really good, in my opinion. He seems to slowly but surely getting to the form that Chicago fans thought that they were getting when they first signed Madron. And for you guys, hopefully he continues to play the way that he did against Toronto, and the Union have to be aware of him because the Chicago Fire try to get him the ball as much as they can. Point number 2, the Union, they have to be strong defensively between minutes 46 to 60. The Union have given up 5 goals so far this season between those minutes, 56 and 60. Even though they defended well in that time frame against Miami, they struggled in that time frame against Chicago the last time these guys played, and they also struggled against Orlando during that time frame. So a little bit of concern for the Union, just for whatever reason, they switch off mentally coming out of halftime, and we've seen it more times than not this season as well. The first 10 minutes of the game, the Union just starts slow, and they've conceded goals like they did against Chicago, like they did against Orlando. So I really want to see the Union just be strong defensively between minutes 56 and 60. And if you go ahead and look at Chicago, 4 of their 17 goals this season have come between those time frames. So the Union are going to have their hands full, I believe, coming out of the break. Whether or not they're leading into halftime or not, that's another story. But one thing I know is Chicago is going to come out of halftime just totally focused and firing on the Union. And point number 3, continue to feed the ball to Corey Burke. Corey Burke has to continue to get good service from the Union. You just mentioned Daniel Gazdag. That was his second start as a striker. He did it against New York Red Bulls, and he did it against Inter Miami. Not really sure if the Union plan on starting him up top again, because we're recording this podcast on a Tuesday. Neither teams have had their midweek press conference to give injury updates and player availability. So I'm not really sure what the lineup is going to look like yet for the Union. Probably find out a better idea come Thursday, Friday, I would imagine, once they have the press conferences. Jamiro Montero, look, the Union always try to get him the ball, but he's going to be heavily marked, in my opinion. And so they've just got to try to get their playmakers on the ball so they can continue to feed the ball to Corey Burke, who has 8 goals in 6 games, and that's including 2 goals that he scored against the Chicago Fire in a U.S. Open Cup game. And then for a bonus point, I would say for Chicago, just keep the same intensity that they had against Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, again, you have to sort of dust that off and just find a way to put the ball in the back of the net, because you clearly did everything right against Toronto except for the final piece. And there's you know, it's sort of like the director of a play. The director of a play, his contract ends his or her contract will end the day that the play actually starts running, because they can only do so much. Once the actors and actresses are on the stage, can't do anything. Once the attackers are in the final third, there's not much that any coach in the world can do. You know, and it was Pep Guardiola who really, you know, had his boys so regimented, building out of the back and in the middle third of the field. But once they got into the middle third, this is when he was at Barcelona. You know, Thierry Henry talks about it all the time. He said we were allowed to express ourselves any way that we wanted. Everything leading up to the final third was so meticulously planned, exactly where your starting positions were supposed to be. But once you got into that attacking third, you know, hands off and express yourself, creativity, whatever it might be. And so the Fire, you know, can't do anything. You can practice finishing all you want, but nothing's going to, you know, prepare you for finishing in a course of 90 minutes other than finishing. So like you said, I think keeping up the same intensity, just sort of dusting yourself off. And, you know, the Fire is still looking for their first road win since decision day of 2019. So at some point you just got to buck up and try to get that 3 points on the road. And listen, it could be a 3 points that maybe sparks a different outlook of the season moving forward. And they need that, you know, that plane ride back to Chicago to be a fun one. You know, they haven't had a joyous, you know, transportation back to the city of Chicago since decision day of 2019. And if you go even further back, the last meaningful road win wasn't from, I think it was August of 2019, because the decision day of 2019, both Orlando and Chicago were knocked out of the playoff picture. So, you know, they're still looking for that. But I think that, you know, we're for the most part healthy. Stanislav Ivanov, you know, made his debut against DC United, coming on as a late substitute. We didn't see him against Toronto, but, you know, we're almost healthy. Carlos Teren is the only one to get off that list, other than Kenny Kronholm, who's been there for over a year now. So it's definitely going to be an interesting one. And you guys are a great team, and it's always fun. And Jim Curtin, obviously, with his ties to Chicago and his relationship with Rafael Wicki and how good friends those two guys are from Chivas USA days. So it's always fun when you know, these two teams meet. And, you know, last year was proven that, even though we went down 10 men, and, you know, we were still able to have that goal line opportunity cleared by Andrew Wooten. So I'm looking forward to the game. It's nationally televised on Unimas and Twitter and TUDN. So I have the weekend off, in which I'll be moving into a new apartment, and hopefully I'll have my TV and Wi-Fi set up by the time that the game kicks off on Sunday at 5:00. So that's my weekend plan before the game starts.
And then before you know it, Premier League Soccer's back, and hopefully, we were talking before, hopefully for your sake, Liverpool make a couple more signings, and then Liverpool fans can relax. But Tyler, it's been a blast having you here on the podcast yet again. You're always so insightful, and Good luck to the Chicago Fire the rest of the season. It's been far too long since they've last been to the playoffs. So I know for your sake, Tony's sake, and just everybody that's a fan of Chicago Fire, you guys are hoping that it's this year, but you guys have some work to make up. And for us Union fans, we're hoping that we can start a new winning streak going into Club America, and hopefully we can pick up 3 points. I'm not going to give a prediction because people are like, oh, you suck at making predictions. Stop making it. So I'm just going to hope that we get a lot of goals scored and hopefully the Union win. That's all I'm going to say. But Tyler, before you go, where can people find you on social media?
Twitter at TN Terens, TNTERENS. I recently got verified. Humble brag, so I just need to throw that out there. So if you're looking for me, it's that handsome guy with the check mark next to his name. And then of course the Intercontinental Football Show is the new podcast that I started with Arlo White, where we talk about the Fire for about 10-15 minutes any given podcast, and then we talk about world football headlines. Obviously Arlo's Premier League forte. We're going to talk about the debate as to who is more important to MLS to European transfers, Christian Pulisic or Weston McKennie this week. So that should be an interesting conversation. And we'll talk U.S. Women's National Team and Arlo being in Tokyo. So a lot on the docket and a really fun podcast. So you can check us out anywhere that you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, the like. So Todd, appreciate you having me on, pal.
Yeah, no problem, Tyler. It's been a blast. And for all you guys listening, I'll be sure to include, like I always do, all of those where you can find Tyler, the show, and everything in the show notes. But follow the podcast at Free Kick Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And check out the podcast wherever you get it at The Free Kick. But until then, my name is Todd, and this is The Free Kick Podcast.